SG's CAC as co-chairs of the Expert Advisory Group. From the onset, I would like to thank the Global Coalition for the Reintegration of Child Soldiers and the Advisory Group for its commitment to encourage action to fully assist children emerging from armed groups and forces. In 2018, the SRSG for Children and Armed Conflict, together with UNICEF, created a global coalition for Reintegration of Child Soldiers, GCR, which comprises of UN agencies, member states, NGOs, World Bank, and academics. Furthermore, 28 members constitute the Group of Friends on Reintegration, namely Andorra, Argentina, Belgium, Canada, China, Djibouti, Dominican Republic, France as co-chair, Germany, Indonesia, Ireland, Japan, Kazakhstan as another co-chair, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Malta as the third co-chair, Mexico, Poland, Qatar, Republic of Korea, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, and Uruguay. The work on reintegration focuses on the access to services and activities which children should be allowed to partake in once they are back to their countries of origin or wherever they might find themselves. With this in mind, our discussion today will focus on 3 thematic briefing papers as part of a roadmap process for the Global Coalition. To explore the current status and issues surrounding funding for programs and activities to help children regain their lives and consider options for more sustainable opportunities moving forward. This launch was originally planned for March 2020, but as with other meetings, COVID-19, as we all know, has changed all our plans. These series of papers, namely 1, Gap and Needs of Children Associated with Armed Forces and Armed Groups, Successful Reintegration, and the second one, Reaffirming Child Reintegration from the Humanitarian Action to Development, Peace Building, Prevention, and Beyond, and the third one, Financing Support for Child Reintegration, were anyway released in 2020. Today marks their official launch and presentation of concrete recommendations and their implementation. We are thus pleased to have this opportunity to engage in an open conversation on the subject at hand with the aim to move this agenda forward and keep the momentum going. It is also important to understand how the international community could more effectively support children who have exited armed forces and armed groups, as well as identify the interests of the different stakeholders. At the end of the presentations, the floor will be open for any questions as well as interventions. So without any further ado, I would like to proceed by giving the floor to SRSG for Children and Armed Conflict, Ms. Virginia Gamba, to deliver her remarks. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Excellencies, members of the Friends of Reintegration Group, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted that finally we are gathered together to present and launch the 3 briefing papers developed by the Global Coalition for Reintegration, and, as Her Excellency just mentioned, this is an event that should have taken place over a year ago. I would particularly like to thank the governments of Malta, Republic of Korea, Poland, and the United Kingdom for their core support provided for this work during the 12-month roadmap process that resulted in these papers and in these recommendations. We are here today because we all agree that child reintegration is a principal interest for all of us, the children and their communities, states, regions, and the global community. As we will hear today, supporting these children is a challenge that transcends the humanitarian development peace-building nexus. To date, despite valiant attempts by many, we have collectively failed in this vital endeavor to ensure adequate and timely assistance. As DSG Amina Mohammed articulated in her foreword to the summary report, Such efforts to ensure a continuum of care are the embodiment of the difficulties we face in fully implementing the 2030 Agenda. There could be no nobler cause than working across the Nexus to support these children and breaking the cycle of conflict. And it would serve as an ideal case study, or if you wish, proof of concept, should we choose to seize upon it. Reintegration has been at the core of the CAC mandate since its inception. For example, the action plan signed between the United Nations and parties to conflict contain provisions already to ensure reintegration of the young people released from armed forces and groups. I have advocated since the beginning of my tenure 4 years ago that we must hold ourselves accountable and close the circle of advocacy by helping those children we call to be released. States have also recognized the strategic significance of this issue and have committed themselves to ensure the reintegration of children by signing key documents such as the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict, the Paris Principles and Commitments, the Vancouver Principles, and of course the Safe Schools Declaration, among others. I would also like to add a brief word on what this meeting is not about. It's not about repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters and their families and children. It is important that we do not conflate the two. Today will be a practical discussion about the contents of the papers, and we will leave the FTF discussion for other events, such as the Araya formula discussion we had earlier this year under the auspices of the Russian Federation. As you will hear today, reintegration programming faces a critical financial crisis, with the needs for short, medium, and long-term sustainable reintegration increasing every year and being exacerbated by the pandemic, and yet funding for reintegration programming is indeed decreasing, and we must change this. Last year alone, 8,521 children were verified as having been recruited and used in conflicts around the globe. Mercifully, 12,643 were also released, thanks to the advocacy by my office and colleagues on the ground, notably UNICEF. But upon release, only a small fraction of those get the support they need beyond the immediate humanitarian assistance, and 25% get no support at all, not even humanitarian immediate support. Regrettably, the COVID pandemic has further increased vulnerabilities for children in conflict-affected situations. The report launched by my office in May of this year, called The Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Violations Against Children in Situations of Armed Conflict, states that reintegration activities were negatively affected by the pandemic and its related restrictions. Family reunification and economic reintegration support were significantly delayed. Preparation of the communities for the return of the children had to stop, and at the same time, schools were closed, depriving children of essential daytime rehabilitation activities for months at a time. That means we have some catching up to do, and we must redouble our efforts. While we grudgingly acknowledge these realities, we don't end it there, because this meeting is about hope. It is about empowering our institutions to change what they can, fund what they can, and encourage an all-of-society approach to reintegration. In this spirit, my office has already launched 3 follow-on projects to implement the recommendations contained in the papers. Let me walk you through them. First, we will shortly open a research hub in Doha, Qatar, which will, among other activities, help develop ways to improve access to and support for reintegration activities. This hub will be working closely also with a new academic advisory group on reintegration, which grew out of a consultation we had during the roadmap process. This group will broaden the breadth and depth of information we have access to from that community, while also working to identify outstanding research needs, such as to better understand the drivers for recidivism. In the autumn, you will also hear more about the new Financing Innovation Forum. We are developing this with the World Bank. The FIF will build on the recommendations in the financing paper you have before you and dive deeper on current funding modalities and trends to paint a more complete picture and look to the future to join up efforts more efficiently, as well as identify new sources of funding, such as the private sector and microfinancing. The FIF will aim to provide a platform in the long term to share information and ideas to continue to fine-tune support for this critical cohort. And lastly, we're excited to support a stakeholder-led process that was a brainchild of former child soldiers themselves, which, as you know, we workshopped. And we call this process the Nairobi process, which also followed this consultation we had with that specific group. It will bring together scores of former child soldiers in national dialogues that will include other children and former children affected by conflict to weigh in on what they think and what they see as the main priorities for reintegration activities. This will allow a much broader cross-section of former child soldiers to raise their voices and will culminate in a symposium in Nairobi, Kenya, in autumn of next year. We see this process as an essential activity to support their stated desire to become effective agents for peace and change in their countries. In conclusion, let me use this opportunity to invite all states to show political and, if possible, financial support for these reintegration programs, and to join the Friends of Reintegration group led by Malta and France and Kazakhstan, for example, which is at the very heart of these efforts. We look forward to working with all of you in these endeavors, and I thank you very much. I would really love to hand over, if you allow, Madam Chair, to my distinguished co-chair, the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Omar Ebdi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you, Excellency. Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Ambassador Fraser, for your remarks today and for your continued leadership on this topic. We are also grateful to Malta, Kazakhstan, and France for co-chairing the group of Friends of Reintegration and support to the Global Coalition for Reintegration of Child Soldiers throughout the roadmap process. And of course, I want to appreciate Virginia Gamba for her tireless leadership of the Global Coalition and to her staff for keeping the situation of children associated with armed forces and armed groups at the forefront of the CAG agenda. Thank you all member states present today, and particularly the steering committee for your dedication to finding solutions for children who are experiencing conflict. I would also like to recognize the government of Norway as the chair of the Security Council Working Group on Children Affected by Armed Conflict. Norway's commitment to preventing conflict and your partnership with UNICEF to mitigate the effects of conflict on children are invaluable. Since we last met in 2020, despite access constraints caused by COVID-19, UNICEF teams continued to provide a range of care and service to more than 12,000 children who had exited armed forces and armed groups in 19 countries. Approximately 23% of them were girls. UNICEF UNICEF supported 2,673 children. Notable prevention efforts in 2020 included Afghanistan, where UNICEF supported child protection units, prevented 179 boys from enlisting in the Afghan National Police. while in Syria, the establishment by the Syrian Democratic Forces of an age assessment committee and a complaints mechanism as part of their action plan with the UN resulted in the release of 136 children from the ranks of SDF and the screening out of 908 children at the time of recruitment. Yet we face collective challenges to address the needs of these vulnerable children. Looking back over the roadmap process as a coalition, we made significant strides identifying key barriers to effective reintegration of children associated with armed forces and armed groups, and the implications for financing these challenges have. You have seen and will hear today 3 research papers and the recommendations produced through the roadmap process. The papers collectively call for solutions that connect a defined programming model that can span the humanitarian development and peace-building nexus with sustained funding from all of these streams that lead to common results. We shall hear more about the research papers shortly, but let me draw your attention to 4 key findings. First, reintegration support should be available to children according to the needs of the child and his or her family and community. For many children, that support is necessary not for a few months or a year, but for 3 to 5 years. Second, programming should be built around one coherent framework with measurement tools and indicators that can be used across the nexus. Third, research on child reintegration focus on field-level evidence generation to show which program interventions are more effective for further investment. And I'm glad that Virginia Gamba mentioned about that research center in Doha, which will contribute to this. And finally, financing flows for humanitarian, sustaining peace and development programming should connect seamlessly to support effective reintegration. UNICEF has an opportunity to make a significant contribution towards addressing these key findings by leading the collaborative development, a global program on child reintegration. As the Child Protection we have committed ourselves to doing so. During 2020, we held a series of virtual consultations with our program teams across the world who work on child reintegration. These consultations laid the groundwork for developing a joint global program together with all of you and the many engaged NGO, donor, and government partners, as well as affected children and families. In the coming months, we will be reaching out to many of you for your insight and support as we embark on an external consultation process to initiate the collective enterprise. Once again, I want to recognize your efforts and the enormous impact they will have as we move forward. Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations on reaching the end of the roadmap process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdi, and thank you for your kind words and for your remarks. I now turn to the co-chairs of the Expert Advisory Group. Ms. Bridget Weiser, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone from around the world. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I'm going to do my best to show my screen. I do have a presentation for you today, and hopefully you will be able to see it. Please let me know if you can see it. Thank you so much. So it's a real pleasure this morning for us to present the findings on one of the papers, the gaps and needs in child reintegration. And I want to thank the colleagues in the expert advisory group, which really formed a huge part of this, World Vision, War Child, Save the Children, a whole host of other organizations, members of the UN family that fed into this process or to this paper. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about first what the findings were around what is successful child reintegration, what it means for all of us. The findings are, of course, I think as was said already, that they should be holistic. That means wrapping around the child and their needs, wrapping around their family, looking at a variety of needs that they may have faced and addressing the experiences that they had, both that might have driven them to be associated with an armed force or armed group, and the experiences that they had. As DED Abdi said, of course, they should be long-term. We need to have the support across the needs to address the needs over the course of a child's life, and how that child can actually best gain their support. So focused on the child, but also both from a support perspective, but also to monitor and make sure that we are actually being effective. Of course, it should be participatory. I think SRSG Gamba's call for the Nairobi consultation is an emblematic of that. How are children engaged in their own reintegration and informing our programming? Prevention is also a key aspect. So it's about preventing as well their re-recruitment if conflict is ongoing, but also to address their vulnerabilities, other vulnerabilities that they may have. So it's preventive from a number of facets. We also think that we found that child reintegration should be responsive to the local realities, very different in different settings, in different conflict situations, different capacities on the ground, in rural settings, urban settings, etc. As well, should balance the individual and community needs. So not overly stigmatizing, overly calling attention to former child soldiers, but allowing them to fully reintegrate and become part of the community, but also looking at what the community's needs are as well, with a whole host of children affected by conflict in other ways. We also really found that supporting system strengthening wherever possible is key. That is, investing in existing structures where they exist, or supporting the development of existing systems where they don't yet exist, so that we're not creating independent, separate, siloed programs just for children associated with armed forces or armed groups, but they're embedded in this existing structures. And of course, that government success is much more clear when it's government led, with that investment, that interest, and that sustained support, including, as was said, across the nexus. What are the barriers to successful reintegration that we found? So some of it was about lack of consistent leadership by government. Potentially it's around capacities that might happen in a situation of armed conflict, or just not necessarily a recognition of the impact that child reintegration and the strategic importance of child reintegration in peace processes. As well, coordination of sectors. It's a multi-sector enterprise, child reintegration is. It includes addressing a child's health, mental health, economic, social, family, all sorts of drivers. And so the sectors that are involved, both from a government and from the UN, are really important to engage. There are also logistics challenges. How are children able to exit armed forces and armed groups in places where there's ongoing conflict, or how can we reach children in places of extreme insecurity, or in rural situations where it's quite remote? These are real constraints, both from a physical basis, but also a cost. As well, I mentioned already stigma and lack of social cohesion. There's a lot of stigma associated to children who may have become associated with an armed force or an armed group, regardless of the means that they did become associated, partly because of their experiences and the assumptions that are made, and because conflict, of course, involves communities and opposing sides. So how do we advance social cohesion, improve acceptance, and reduce stigma? Really key questions for us as a sector. As well, in many cases, or in certain cases, there's insufficient community engagement and support. Some of this is around making sure that we don't fly in and when we have money, take over and not be integrated into the community, but and take over and then leave when there isn't sufficient funding and leave something that's not sustainable behind? How do we actually engage in the local realities, as I was saying before? How do we make sure that it's community driven, child driven, family driven? And as well, there's a question of discrimination and how do we, it's related to stigma, but not exclusively so. How do we address issues of discrimination or lack of programming that addresses the specific needs of different groups of children? So there are also, and I think we mentioned that this paper also was kind of focused a little bit on how these barriers and challenges might also impact the financing part of it. So we also looked at what are the challenges are to estimating the scale of the problem and the costs of the problem, or the cost of how to address the problem. It is a really difficult set of questions. So there's a lack of clarity on the scale in contexts, including specifically just the number of children. As we've mentioned before, and the SRSG mentioned, and as well the ED Abdi, about how much the MRM has been able to document and how many children we have been able to reach. That's really just a tip of the it's a tip of the iceberg, and because of the constraints and the really the need to do significant verification, you know, it doesn't necessarily allow us to really get a handle on and predict and estimate well the number of children that are currently associated with armed forces or armed groups, and or those that may need. The stigma also prevents them from potentially seeking assistance, so that they may remain invisible. Again, as I mentioned, the location of children in the communities of return, the remoteness, the security barriers involved, and potentially ongoing conflict in those areas of return. There's also significant variation among community needs. So even in one country context, in different regions, there may be different strengths and capacities, and also different needs, different drivers of conflict, and different impacts of conflict on children. And those are hard to quantify and hard to cost and estimate. Activity costs, of course, across contexts, this is nothing new. You know, different economies, inflation, etc., all has an impact on how we account for costs and estimates. And of course, the question is by child. Every child has their own special needs or specific needs, and so there may be one child may have more inside resilience and be able to come out of an experience a bit differently than another, and so the cost can vary, the services required can vary, the length of services required can vary. Costs of system strengthening is always difficult to quantify. So as I mentioned before, system strengthening is a key part of it, but how we look at that and how we estimate how many children we can reach through that and what those investments will look like is also different. So as well, I've talked about logistics and security. This is related to sort of the programs that we do put in place, the cost of the security of personnel and the risks of protecting them from risks is important. And of course, child protection and child reintegration in particular, a very human resource intensive enterprise. We are looking to really work directly with children, and that takes time and trust. And of course, as I mentioned, there's multiple other complementary sectors that need to be engaged. So what are the impact of funding cycles and priorities? So some of it is related to there's sort of an increased need, which is coupled with a decrease in funding. We have findings related to that. That there's a tendency to focus on reintegration very much, although not exclusively, and it's changing, but the tendency is typically to focus child reintegration within the humanitarian sector, the humanitarian part of our humanitarian development peace building nexus, so it doesn't reach as far, and the funding cycles of the humanitarian sector, as everybody knows, are quite short term, because the goal is for the humanitarian crisis to be alleviated soon and quickly. Nevertheless, there are protracted conflicts in that, but there isn't necessarily seamless funding that allows that. So there's limitations on the humanitarian cycle. As well, within humanitarian response plans, the HRPs, child reintegration isn't always visible, and that's because it's quite sensitive sometimes, as well as it's not, it is compared to the millions of children in need affected by conflict, it's a relatively smaller portion, but of a one of high need. So it's not necessarily as visible in what we do, and the sensitivity around it is quite clear. I've discussed the costing challenges and, of course, the political sensitivities around how we engage with different armed groups, in particular non-state actors, and how we accomplish the exit of children from those groups. All these impact our ability to predict and to have priorities. Of course, COVID had an additional impact. So looking at what's moving forward from the paper, we did find that it was important for us potentially to develop a common strategic vision for programming. I think that's what our Deputy Executive Director mentioned, a common strategic vision for programming for reintegration that has a shared definition of success. What does it mean to be forced to have successful reintegration? And a monitoring framework that'll allow us to measure our success, but also adapt it as needed as we learn. There's also a need to balance individual and community support so that you don't overprivilege one versus the other. You adequately address the individual needs of a child, and so whatever framework we want to put in place needs to be able to account for that, as well as have this prevention and response components, direct services versus system strengthening. And as much as I have the word versus in there, it's not individual versus in opposition, but it is actually both individual and community support, both prevention and response, direct service and system strengthening. Really, really important, but complicated. As I've already mentioned, we moving forward, we want to look at situating reintegration as a strategic intervention across this nexus, engage a range of actors and sectors, as I've mentioned, livelihoods, health, all sorts of education, etc. And to really seek government leadership both in situations of armed conflict, countries that are affected by conflict, but also those who may be able to really contribute in other ways. And as well, as was already mentioned, we need to set a new research agenda for child reintegration. We have a lot of learning from past conflicts, which there was sort of an upscale of that research and then a downscale, and now I think we're looking at what are the current gaps and how we would need to fill those gaps. So I'm happy to have questions later on after colleagues, but that is maybe I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Faisa, for shedding light on the barriers that hinder children's successful reintegration. And for those who who are not following the chat, there were questions on whether the presentations could be shared, and yes, they will be available on the website within the next few days. So if anybody is interested in looking at any of the presentations that will be shared today, you will be able to find them. I now invite Ms. Sharon Riggle to present some key findings on the reframing and financing papers.
Thank you, Excellency. It's a pleasure to address you all today and to come to the end of this roadmap process, which has been long and incredibly interesting. So thank you for your interest in the results and recommendations of these reports. I also have but let me see. Okay. There we go. Okay. So hopefully this will work. I'm going to be speaking not completely to all of the slides. I'm going to go off piste a little bit in the presentation. Here we go. Okay, so
Great. Yes, we're seeing your presentation.
There you are. Okay, good. Yes, I apologize. You're all my guinea pigs for this one. So yes, so I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from two of the other two papers. This was really a collective effort amongst NGOs, UN, World Bank, academics to pull together this information. And as Bridget noted, there were some lead agencies on that. And what we found, so we have the reframing child reintegration, and some of the points that I'm going to cover have been covered already by previous speakers, but I think that's a good thing. What we aimed to do at the beginning of this process was to interweave the three papers. There is so much information, we broke it into three, but there's a lot of cross-fertilization, let's say. So I'll try to skip over things that we've already covered today. But I think that we all came out of this process enlightened. I think we all had an idea about what some of the problems were with reintegration, both from a coordination perspective as well as a funding perspective. And we all, after the research was done, we all learned a lot about this. So it's a pleasure to share all of it with you. So we have the first slide here, which is the reframing of child reintegration. So we wanted to take it out of just the humanitarian sphere. We wanted to spend time looking at how can we make it relevant for development actors, for peace building actors, for prevention activities. Excuse me. And how could we demonstrate that this is a strategic intervention for everybody interested in peace in the country? Not only we have to take care of the children that we are advocating for to be released, and we have to ensure that they receive, as DED Abdi said, 3 to 5 years of support, you know, with a rather diminishing amount of support over time, but still support nonetheless, and take it out of the humanitarian, just the humanitarian sphere, which, as Bridget mentioned, is where it normally sits. So we did a deeper dive on some of these documents and some of these processes. So getting to what we need, one of the things we realized that we need in order to be able to measure this better, in order to be able to work together better, and I speak also as a UN actor, where that is a perpetual goal for us, is to coordinate our actions for an outcome. That we need agreed metrics and collective outcomes, regardless of who's funding what. And that I served on a country team in Nepal, and I do remember it is difficult to get all the cats to herd in the same direction, and so a lot of that has to do with mandate, a lot of that has to do with funding. But on this particular issue, as we're looking at this new way of working for the UN, as we're looking at the SDGs, there is an imperative, and now there's a framework for us to really walk in the same direction and better enmesh our activities. So looking at agreed metrics and collective outcomes for this cohort is one of the key needs that we need to achieve. So we also have, there's better cooperation as well. So talking to each other and breaking down the silos. And you'll see the quote that I have here from the paper, which is, there's much good work being done and to some extent lost in silos. So having us cooperate and coordinate better is key. And the joint planning, and this goes to the UN and NGOs and donors as well, bridging that divide. Better coordination. We realize that many are already contributing to good reintegration outcomes as we did the research. There is, there's food security, there's security sector reform, there's vocational training, there's all sorts of things that are helping build that that system that we need to help these children reintegrate, but also to build resilience in the communities to prevent a reoccurrence and a re-recruitment of these same children. So as we look at agreed metrics and better coordination, we also need a common theory of change and strategic vision. And there's a slide on that coming up. But bringing in more actors is something else that we realized we need to do. So, well, there are already several actors involved. We're not we're not inventing the wheel here from scratch, but better ways to utilize local knowledge, bring in civil society, private sector, which we plan to do in our Financing Innovation Forum, and local actors. There's also tools like the common country analyses to strengthen the evidence base for joint decision making and sharing that information and that data. And then also looking at, in order not to reinvent the wheel, what is already effective? How can we scale it up? Can we scale it up? And that'll come up in a slide here in a minute too. Yes, I'm looking at my notes, and a lot of what I have said has already been, what I was going to say has already been said. But one of the key phrases I wanted to drop in too is that we always hear there's no peace without development, there's no development without peace. Well, we can also look at, transformational reintegration, I guess is what I would call it. Without transformational reintegration, there's also no peace. So on to the next slide. And I've played with animations here. So this was this is a slide to demonstrate that there are different actors doing different things. Like I said, psychosocial support, education, security sector reform. This is not all humanitarian, clearly, and it's not all one agency. But what it does do is build a comprehensive reintegration support for these children and strengthen those institutions and systems that Bridget was referring to, which is the ultimate goal to on the prevention side of things, reduce recidivism and build a stronger system. I don't have a slide for this, but key elements of the reframing reintegration, I'll just name 6 and move on. Ensure a comprehensive long-term approach based on the SDGs and employing multi-year predictable funding. So we look at a comprehensive and long-term approach, but also the multi-year predictable and sustained funding is one of the things that we've realized that we've always known is one of the elements. And one of the reasons after maybe 3 or 6 months, some of these children no longer receive assistance because there was no transition to a development program for them. So bridging, and this is the key pillar of the reframing paper, is bridging the humanitarian development and peace building nexus. Now we use that term a lot in the UN. And what we found is that it's often a chasm or there's an abyss between those 3 pillars. And what we need to do and what we can do is build bridges across the nexus for these children, because they shouldn't be suffering because our institutions can't coordinate ourselves appropriately between humanitarian and development, for example. We need to have that longer term plan. Bringing in a broader range of public and private sector stakeholders across research, policy, and practice is another element. Expanding assistance to a longer time frame as needed. Using plans, strategies, and policies to reach SDGs by 2030. Including 8.7, which is the elimination of child soldiers and the children associated with armed forces and armed groups, CAFAG, as we say in our shorthand. And then really emphasizing prevention and longer term development and peace building gains. So this is the what I was referring to earlier, is that reintegration, what we're looking at too, not only from a humanitarian and human perspective, helping these children that have been traumatized by armed forces and armed groups and all the things they've experienced, and other children affected by armed conflict. But how can we use the reintegration support and bridging this nexus to really achieve a common goal, which is a robust protective environment for children. So if we look at, and this is what the slide is attempting to demonstrate, if we can get everybody on the same path, working at an early stage, talking together, and identifying what that common theory of change is, we have a much better chance of achieving it. So this is financing support. So I'm just going to go back because I have a couple more points on the reframing. So reintegration, not to get too deep into the background on this, but reintegration, why it's a strategic intervention. It mitigates drivers of conflict, it reduces risks, it strengthens resilience, and all of this underpins the social cohesion and economic gain. So not only, as we said, is it a humanitarian and human centered intervention, it also is a peace building intervention. And the paper also states that SDGs are the framework upon which a comprehensive approach stands. All SDGs to which all member states have signed up affect children, and 8.7 mentions the goal of eliminating recruitment and use, as I mentioned. The SDGs also highlight the inextricable link between human rights, peace, and development. They must be taken together, and this is what the research that we found as well. Reframing child reintegration calls for better funded, multi-sectoral approach to reintegration by a far broader range of public and private sector stakeholders than is currently the norm, within the overall rubric of increasing the responsibility and accountability of national counterparts over time. And the SDGs again allows for such framing. And this is another core finding from the reframing paper, is national ownership and partnering and integrating external interventions into the domestic institutions and practices. And I think I will leave it there. Looking at the rest here, it looks like has already been said. So I think I'm going to move on to the reframing paper. The financing paper. Here we go. So the three main objectives. So what we wanted to do, the reframing paper was making the argument about why reintegration is strategic for anybody interested in peace in a country, going from the let's help the children to the broader peace building goals. The financing paper, which is what started this initiative, and at the beginning was, oh, we just need more money. Let's throw more money at it. Well, we realized as we went along that yes, it's very underfunded. The needs are increasing, and the funding has been decreasing for these children, even though it's a small number and it's a very strategic cohort of the population that needs to be supported for these 3 to 5 years, which is a relatively short period of time. Definitely funding is a pillar of that, but as you've heard and as you've seen, it is not the only the issue. So what we did want to do is dive into the financing and funding issue, financing and funding modalities and mechanisms, which I know is people's eyes glaze over when you mention things like that, but it is fundamental to this issue. So we wanted to achieve three main objectives: to map the existing funding and financing flows across the Nexus as best we could, and never been done before, so it was a challenge. To identify and evaluate innovative funding and financing modalities, and then to present options. So I'm not going to go through all of the details of this because there really is a list of, where funding is coming from and where it's going to in case studies, but really to demonstrate, excuse me, but really to demonstrate that there's a lot more work to be done, which is what the Financing Innovation Forum intends to do. In the next one. So we started looking at this, and we realized that there were it needed to be, as Bridget said, it needed to be really tailored to the specific situation where the children found themselves. And we realized as well that, what works in Colombia is not going to work in Congo, is not going to work in Iraq. So it's not a one size fits all by any measure. But what we did realize was a very useful general tool was to break it down into 4 conflict typologies. 1 is at risk. 2 is highly fragile but functional. 3, severely conflict affected, and 4, total state collapse, widespread violence, insecurity. And within that, we wanted to look at different types of funding tools, what works best where, and which mix works well. And one of the findings as well is the pooled funding, for example, is a new tool that we should really be taking advantage of more. But I'll get to that in a minute. So some of the key principles for effective financing is, first, of course, coordination. I know we talk about that ad nauseum, but it really is fundamental, and it's free. And that's something else we wanted to look at. What can be done that doesn't cost money? How can we do what we're doing better? What is working? What can be scaled up? How can we better organize ourselves? How can we make it as good as we can get, and then go for the funding? So I think that's a core principle for us. Also, accountability and transparency, we found, was in that there's a lot of interviews done and desk research, and in the interviews, and it came out that accountability and transparency, both in funding and in programming, is key to build knowledge, to build relationships, to build buy-in by all the stakeholders. Also, context-specific programming, as we discussed, national ownership and capacity strengthening, as I mentioned. This needs to be elevated. Reintegration should be a stopgap measure, and it should be eventually owned by the country where these children are living. And then also linkages with the SDGs. Excuse me. So some of the findings and learnings, and there are many, so I encourage you to go to our website and download the paper. But we had small scaling it is what I've put there, which is basically how can we achieve some of these goals without blowing it up into a giant multi-million-dollar program. Is there any way for us to support local initiatives or small local initiatives or even international initiatives without without drowning it? And I use the analogy of watering a flower with a fire hose, right? Too much money can also be problematic. So how can we do that better and get the outcomes we're looking for? Also, retrofitting, I talked about what are we already doing and how can we do it better? That's what that refers to. importance of predictability and sustainability. And for anybody who works with UN and NGOs knows that this is a constant mantra that we say. The predictability of funding. There have been reintegration programs that have stopped after 3 months, 6 months, because suddenly the money dried up, but then the money came a month later and they had to recreate everything. So it just we need a longer time frame, basically, and we need to know it's coming. Well, I say we, but it's UNICEF and our colleagues on the ground carrying out these activities. Yes, there's potential funding options, which I won't get into here, but this is some of the recommendations. Was the development of a new multi-country child reintegration pooled fund that could be drawn on in short order by those doing these activities, and UNICEF especially. Modest as always, they do amazing work on the ground. These 12,000 children that were released last year, for example, when these children are released, there's not a bucket of money that NGOs or UNICEF can pull from. They have to scramble and find that funding. And it's amazing. It's amazing what they do. And so we're looking at different ways we can support that process better. There's also the Peace Building Fund, which has been pointed to by many as being flexible, as being fast, maybe being, maybe there's something there that we could work with in terms of child reintegration. And the World Bank is also starting a new reintegration fund, and there might be earmarked funds for child reintegration in future. Then, of course, lastly, the future studies. And I think this is what the academic advisory group that the SRSG mentioned will be covering. I realize I'm getting really to the end of my time here, but before I say thank you and hand back to the chair, I just wanted to add one more point. Yes, it's this, and it refers to the learning agenda. So there's limited longitudinal evidence on what types of interventions are most effective in the long term. And, we've talked to a lot of the academics, some of them are with us today. And so establishing a research or learning agenda is one of the core features that we would like to achieve as well in terms of recommendations. There's more I could say, of course, but I think I'm going to leave it there, and I thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very valuable information. Very interesting and very important. I'd like to thank all the panelists for sharing their reflections. And now we can move to the interventions with the scene set by our excellent